Nationers, one of my favorite shows growing up was MythBusters, a show with a bunch of geeky scientist people that know how to make a bunch of cool contraptions. They ended up having a question. In every episode, they would test that question, aka a myth. And whether that myth was busted or whether it was true, which I guess is also busting the myth. And many myths that they had did not air. And one of them today we're going to hear about from Adam Savage himself is the never aired myth Jamie killed with one question. What might be that one question? What might be the myth that they were trying to test? And most importantly, let's get right into it.
Ryan Massey asks.
Here we go. Shout out Ryan Massey for asking this question.
Was there ever a myth you wanted to test, but it fell apart before anything interesting occurred or could be filmed? A specific example of that does not come to mind, but there was one in which we did a huge amount of prep only to throw the whole myth.
Oh, that must be so rough.
Like one interaction. So we were doing the Indiana Jones myth,
okay,
which had some fat stories in it. Given the timing of the darts in the throne room of the opening of Raiders, could Indy have outrun the darts? Yes. We built a throne room with step-activated dart guns. It was so spectacular. Then we did, could Indy have put his whip over a tree trunk and swung across? Yes. We built this huge experimental protocol based on truck containers where I swung over a 20-foot chasm. It was so spectacular.
Oh, my.
And in there, we also wanted to do the Indy running from the big ball story, right? So we bought a Zorb.
Out of all things, buying a Zorb is really funny. This is pretty cool because obviously a lot of movie things are like movie magic, things that we feel like are impossible, but really these superheroes or these really talented people like Indiana Jones in this instance were able to do, outrunning darts, maybe outrunning now the Zorb ball. And I'm interested to see what this question is. I wonder if it's Indiana Jones related because I've seen the movies. I was fairly young, so I'm interested to see where this is heading.
One of those big inflatables that you can get inside of that are mostly famous for horrifying YouTube videos of people bouncing down mountains in them. But the Zorb is a spectacular fun thing that we got, and Jamie started aestheticizing the Zorb. He was painting a foam urethane on it to turn it into a rock, and we were getting ready to talk about the parameters of its sliding and moving and our running, and then Jamie was like, why? And we were all like, so he didn't just say why. He was like, why are we doing the stone? What are we testing? We don't know the weight of the original stone. We don't know really how far it went. So we're only answering how we can outrun a Zorb, but there's no stakes to this, and there's not really a test to it. And do we really need it? And there really was like this moment, and I feel like Dan Tapster was there that day. I feel like he was. Dan was our executive producer who wasn't always on set. He produced the show out of Manchester, England, where he lived, but would come to the set a few times a year to spend a week with us. And I think he was on set that day, and I just feel like I remember Jamie asking that question and everyone kind of going, bleep, 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 bleep.
That's funny because, like, for sure, you have no idea. I'm sure you can find the math. I know there's a billion people that, you know, are super geeky at math and can find the actual weight of the ball, especially with the circumference and all that good stuff. Why? Great. I love it. I love it. I absolutely love that.
Realizing there's no other answer to his question than this is not an interesting story. It's not an interesting, because it's not an interesting.
It's a cool concept, though.
It's not
if they do it right.
Within the parameters that is truly testable. We don't have the same things. We don't have any marker. There's no such thing as a large round stone that anyone has to outrun. So how do we figure out what we're testing? And then we threw out that story. Like literally, it was a 5 minutes from we're actively all working on running this big stone ball to, yeah, that's done. We're done. We're not doing it. It really was, to be frank, I really appreciated that about making that show. I talked early in this live stream about the pressures the network has to make their money off of the backs of the people making shows for them.
Right.
And the pressures they transmit to the people making shows for them. And one of the great and incredible graces of making the show with Carrie, Tori, Grant, Jamie, and everybody else and the entire team was the show was a hit so early and for so long. We were really insulated from those network pressures until very late in our run. I mean, they would ask us to do things like Deadliest Catch episodes and, Man versus Wild stuff and other things like that.
Right.
But for the most part, we didn't have to deal with network interference on that because the show was so well loved, and
Yeah.
we loved making it, and that all worked and fired on all
Successful
the cylinders
too.
for that length of time. The ADHD Media wants to know about a project I have always wanted to make with my partner, with my wife. ADHD Media is married, and the idea of making something with their wife has always been floating in their mind. I want to tell you a story, and I'm not the hero of the story. And for the longest time, my wife and I would have friction in the kitchen around
cooking,
specifically around her asking me to execute something in a very specific way.
Oh,
and
okay.
So I'll let you know right away that my wife is an incredibly gifted cook. Really, really.
That's always
has a
great.
natural
That's really always
sense
great.
of taste, but also menu. How different tastes and dishes combine and collaborate to give
I'm putting
really
chicken
and she
and
loves hosting. She loves the whole package. I am excellent at my kitchen skills.
I think chicken goes with anything, to be honest.
I am really good at using the burners and the stoves. I'm an excellent baker. But when it comes to really specific techniques sometimes, and also thinking about a menu, specifically thinking around a menu is not my core competence. Both of my kids and my wife are far better at that than me. But I didn't admit that to myself for the longest time.
Might have been hard.
For the longest time, I was like, I've got all these kitchen skills. I can do stuff.
I can turn on the burners.
A lot
Got
of
2
my
hands.
self-esteem is built in how useful these things are, these 2 paddles that are at the ends of my arms. A huge amount of my self-esteem comes from my skill at using these. And my wife and I were having this art. She was like, I want you to cut the garlic really, really thin. And I grabbed a knife, and she's like, you probably want to use a different knife. And I was all like, this is my favorite knife. I want to use my knife. And I got pissy about it. And we got into an argument. And I went away, and I thought, why are you being a dick? Why do you need to use your knife? She's got a very specific idea. She can execute it. And you tried with your knife, and you didn't make the slices thin enough. And then I had to zoom out and be like, you know what? She's a much better cook than I am. I have to admit that.
The stubborn nature of life sometimes. I know I've had things similar to this. It's like, well, like I know how I do it my way. It doesn't mean it's like the most efficient. There's like this scene in like The Good Doctor where that like whole thing arises and whatnot between him and his partner. And it kind of reminds me of this.
And frankly, since I have embraced the fact that I'm the least talented cook in my house, life has been
Tough pill to
so
swallow.
much better. Our collaborations in the kitchen are far, far better because I've removed my ego and self-esteem from my skill with these in the kitchen. She has a very specific thing she wants executed in a certain way. I'm here to say, yes, chef. And that is like it was a sea change for me, creatively and collaborationally. In contrast, there's a moment in which I was drawing a floor plan of one of the floors in our house, and I was about to measure. When I draw a floor plan, I draw out a rough map of the room where the windows and doors are, and then I draw the measurements I want and put a blank bubble between the 2 arrows. So I end up drawing an arrow between the measurement that I want and a bubble that's empty. And then I go into the room and I fill in all the bubbles. And as I've just started to do this, my wife says, do you want some help? And I was like, oh, yeah, absolutely. Here, grab the end of this tape measure. And she's like, okay. And I'm like, and then over the next 5 minutes, I filled in 20 measurements. I was like, go take this to the end of the shelf and put it over there. Great. Okay, now put it over there. Okay, great. Now, if you'll climb up to there and put it on the edge of the thing. No, a little more over there. And it was just, this is me executing the way I have been executing at work for 30 years.
Right.
And at the end, she was like, that was a little intense. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, you're just like monofocused and there's a really
zoomed in
energy. And I realized, like, right, we go to work and we are a certain person at work, and our partner often doesn't ever see that aspect. This is a long way of saying
the stories that he must have too
has been an ongoing creative enterprise. Lately, my partner has been very into ceramics and woodwork. And that has actually opened up a whole new thing for us where we're spending some weekend days here in the cave with me helping her to execute stuff she's working on.
Get the lathe.
Also co-working and working on my own stuff at the same time. And it is really spectacular.
That's super cool.
It is really lovely. And what's funny is until she was interested in the woodwork and the ceramics and the tools that were at her disposal here, this place was overwhelming. And it's a years and years ago,
Look at the background. I'd be like, where is everything?
And I was working in his studio down in the Bayview of San Francisco on Yosemite Street, and he left for Czechoslovakia for like 2 months to go do a big show there.
It's
and
quite a long time.
I lived in his space during those 2 months, and oh man, his space taught me about how spaces welcome or reject you, because his studio was a studio for sleeping and working. There was no entertaining. There was no hanging out. There was literally a shipping crate where he had a mattress and like a hot plate for heating your coffee, and then nothing but tools. So that's
insane.
Get out if you weren't working. You could feel the space rejecting you.
Craftsmanship people are so interested about these things. You know what I mean?
Space for working. If you're not here to work, you're taking it in, but it's overwhelming. It is overwhelming on purpose. I like to be visually overwhelmed. That's what gets me going to work. But I totally understand finding it a little bit much of a muchness.
I could too.
It's a wonderful question.
I know the whole thing is about like the question, why?
It's not a plan, it's a process.
But nonetheless, I'm glad that we got to learn what that hidden Indiana Jones myth that they were trying to test and how it got actually canceled by just a single word, especially with the executive producer from Manchester there too. I'm sure like everyone's like, oh gosh, you know, like that collaborative effort. If they haven't seen that, it'd be weird, but I mean, it has to happen. You got to make the best show possible. And of course, subscribe.